There we go. So tonight, we're incredibly lucky to have two professors from the University of Maine who are going to teach us about how our forests are adapted to cold conditions and how how climate change and our warming winters are starting to pose some challenges to those adaptations. We have Jay Wason, who's assistant professor of forest ecosystem physiology. He's been at UMO since 2018. He came from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, which is now, I think, Yale Center for the Environment. And his research focuses on the physiological responses of northeastern forest trees to new and changing climate conditions. And we also have Ivan Fernandez, who's a professor of soil science. He, in addition to working at the School of Forest Resources, is also part of UMO's Climate Change Institute. And he's particularly interested in how the biogeochemistry of forested ecosystems is affected by the changing chemical and physical climate that we're working with. So I'm going to stop sharing. And Ivan, I think you're going first.
Yes.
All right, take it away.
Thanks. So you can see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Good. Okay. Well, thanks very much for the introduction, and great to be able to connect with the group. It's always much more fun if we were, at that lovely building that you just showed us with the library, doing these kinds of talks. But as we were just discussing, the Zoom has access advantages as well, and gets the job done. And always honored and happy to share a panel or a podium with my friend Professor Wason, who's going to follow here in a minute. I'm kind of the warm-up act. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the changing winter, changing climate in that context, with a few inroads into soils and trees. But when I have a tree question, I go to the other guy that's on the panel here tonight. So I'll turn it over to Jay at that point. I am in the Forest Resources and the Climate Change Institute, and I spent a lot of time interested in understanding the changes that are impacting our natural resources, and how we can both understand them as scientists, but then translate that science into a framework for action. And there's lots of different frameworks for both adaptation and mitigation, and we're not going to go down that road tonight. So I'm going to start with some basics. I've got a Zoom bar here that's in the way of my controls, so I'm going to move that there. There we go. And I'm going to go a little bit quick on a couple of slides, because it's not about the details. It's about sort of the concept that the slides are conveying. And a long time ago, so decades ago, I would start talks with this kind of a slide, asking if Maine's climate is changing. I don't think we have to, probably anyone on the call tonight, and most people are not questioning whether the climate, the nature of weather, and the long-term record of weather that we call climate has not changed in most of our lifetimes in meaningful ways. Just for a little bit of shameless self-promotion, but as a resource, very quickly just talk about the changes that are taking place. And up in the left-hand corner of the slide here, there's 3 reports. This is the 2020 report that comes out of the university, the Climate Change Institute, Sea Grant, and the last one in partnership with Schoodic Institute as well. Maine's Climate Future reports, which are an assessment of the evidence of climate change here in Maine. We see global assessments in IPCC, we see national assessments, but it's really what we know of that's happening in our backyard that we formulate policy and we make decisions around. This is also in 2020, and some of the same people involved here. But this is the state's assessment from the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee of the Maine Climate Council. So it's about 370 pages. I'm one of the co-chairs. That was done in support of the Maine Climate Council and Maine's relatively new action plan from 2020 called Maine Won't Wait. And this is just a short addition to that 1 year later on the first year sort of anniversary of Maine Won't Wait, some scientific update. So the links are at the bottom of that. You can go to these websites and download all of these documents if you were looking for Maine-based climate assessment. What do we know about change in Maine? It was a surprise to no one. It's getting warm. Oh, I should say this middle column is the evidence from the record of the last 100 years. And then this column was or is projections to just mid-century. Normally, we often see it to 2100, and this particular these data came from this report that we focused on 2050. So it's getting warmer, about 3 degrees Fahrenheit, with more expected by mid-century. That's causing the growing season to be longer, or in the context of the discussion tonight, the cold season to be shorter. We have more high heat index days. It's vacation land. We typically had very little high heat index days, but we know we've had the heat waves, and high heat index occurs when humidity is high and the temperature is high, and it's a human health impact. We have more rain, about 15% total precipitation in the last 100 years. Another 5 or 10% by 2050, but actually most important, and we're not going to get into those data tonight, are what we experience in intense rain events and intense precipitation events. So these heavy downpours that have pretty dramatic impacts on ecosystems and human infrastructure. So we're getting more snow in that regard, but overall we have less snow as measured by this one metric of snow water content because it's warmer, and so we get less of the precipitation as snow, more as rain. This map in the corner here is represents the 3 formal climate divisions in the state of Maine, coastal up into the northern or interior. And those percentages represent the anticipated loss of snow by mid-century. And what it's showing is the greatest loss in the coastal region, and then less in the interior. Lots of who we are as Maine, from our economy to our culture, encompasses winter and snow, and both from the standpoint of the commerce and play. And so these are significant changes because the coastal division's already warmer. It's closer to 32 degrees. And so warming is going to have the biggest impact in that region. And then ocean temperature, you've probably heard, is increasing, not relevant to this evening's discussion. Sea level rise is on the march and also increasing. Ignore the next slide. That's from a different presentation, but all of those data come from the state assessment. So besides those obvious factors, how else is winter changing? Dig a little bit deeper into the data around a changing winter. And so on the left, we have the Maine annual temperatures. This is the mean since 1900, so roughly the last 100 years, 120. These are the maximums, and these are the minimums. And what we see in the record relative to warming is that of the 4 seasons, winter is warming faster than the other seasons, and we see winter minimums are warming faster than the mean or the maximum. So the overall increase in the minimums is 4 degrees Fahrenheit over that time period, as compared to 3.2 for the mean, as compared to 2.4 for the maximum. if we sort of dial in the microscope a little bit more and just look at December, January, and February, that's what the GJF is. Over the same time period, just the winter warming itself is clearly warming much faster than the overall annual means. And so winter and the coldest aspects, the coldest character of winter, is what's changing faster than sort of any other metrics of temperature around seasonality and highs and lows. So winter is changing quickly. Does a changing winter matter? And obviously a rhetorical question, but so I borrow this from our friends at Hubbard Brook and the foundation. You know, why does winter matter? Which includes the loss of cold, loss of snow, and a shorter cold period, as we already mentioned. And it matters because it affects all sorts of walks of life. And so you know, our outdoor activities and recreation, which is a huge economy in a northern state like Maine. It impacts water quality, having to do with flood risk and water availability, and that varies depending on where you are in the country. It impacts public health, actually one health, all animals and plants and humans, because many of the pests and pathogens that we have not had up until now are limited by the coldest temperatures of winter, those cold winter lows. And as we just talked about, those are warming the fastest. And so those are allowing ranges to advance. And it's not all just climate change, any of this. There's a number of things happening, but climate change is clearly a critical contributor. You know, the holidays and the human experience, impacts on biodiversity, and in a whole host of different ways. That little image there is playing on the fact that if you're a snowshoe bunny and you're still white in the spring, you suddenly become easy prey for your predator, and that's what those two are supposed to connote. And then finally, relative to tonight's discussion, you know, impacts on forest health, and we'll talk a little bit about that, and Jay will talk more about that, and impacts on forest products and our ability to operate in the woods. We like to harvest on frozen ground, not on mud. There are studies, and a professor at the University of New Hampshire, Alex Contusta, has been leading some really good research around the changing winters over the past few years. This is one of those slides I'm going to be very, very quick on and not dig into the nitty gritty. I show you this slide because this is a table of different metrics, different kinds of measurements that her group looked at or used to evaluate a changing winter. So things like that have an impact on us humans and our activities, and on ecosystems. So besides just temperature and is there snow day, you know, how many thaw days do you have? How many days do you have ice? How many days do you get a frost? There are specific temperature points that are thresholds that will, you know, kill certain insects, for example, or on the other side, allow certain insects to emerge. And that's what these different metrics are. We're not going to get into them in detail here, but you need certain temperatures to make snow. You need certain temperatures to assure a good mosquito kill, which we favor as compared to a mosquito thrive. You know, hemlock woolly adelgid has vulnerabilities. And then, you know, the number of bare ground days, which is not ideal in the winter as compared to snow covered days. Rain on snow events, I'll mention that a little bit more. Bare ground, frozen ground days, and of course, when we get into the spring, bare ground thaw days and mud days, which certainly resonates with us Mainers in many different aspects. So there's a lot of ways to evaluate the character of a changing winter. And for, you know, one of her studies Here are all those metrics. And to no surprise, across this region of study, and there were sites in Maine, a few sites in Maine in that analysis, things like the number of thaw days having to do with warming are increasing, and things that having to do with the cold character of winter are decreasing overall. And so winter is changing in lots of different ways, and lots of complex interactions with us and the ecosystems that we live in and are part of. Take a minute here to talk about soils. I am a soil scientist, so it's my duty. One of the things we're losing, as we already mentioned, is we're losing snow and its character of snow in winter. And one of my graduate students, this fellow right here, Kaizad Patel, it was a PhD student. He now is out at Pacific Northwest National Lab doing good things with carbon and his research there. But a few years ago, he did a snow removal experiment. There's a few of these around in the country. One of them is at Hubbard Brook that I mentioned earlier. And we did this out at University Forest. And the idea here is to manually remove the snow to study aspects of the ecosystem that are impacted by the lack of snow. The snow is an insulating blanket in the winter, and if you remove it, the ground tends to freeze. And this is in the spring, and purposely we took this shot because you can see the perimeter of a snow removal plot. Nearby was a control treatment, meaning we didn't have to shovel it. And you see Kaizad digging through the snow there for some instruments in one of the controls, lots of snow. And then there's a bunch of students that worked for us with shoveling the plots. And we shoveled the plots so that there was just like an inch of snow that had very little insulating impact, but it prevented us from scraping the ground and disturbing it with our shovels and our equipment. We did this in, as it says, 2015, 2016. This is always a favorite slide of Kaizad's because he decided, well, I'm going to do a snow removal experiment. And the first year he decided it was this year, 2015. And so you can see we had a tremendous amount of snow in 2015. So he spent most of his winter, all of those people on that slide, most of the winter shoveling. But then 2016, we got one of the winters that we have more commonly, sort of it's not such a, kind of a ragtag winter compared to the way I remember it type thing. And so keep that in mind when we look at the data on the next slide. The idea of the experiment was to understand essentially the freezing and non-freezing impacts on the soil due to the presence or absence of a snowpack. And I'll take just very quickly describe these two slides. And so these are data from the snowy 2015. These are data from the not so snowy 2016. This light blue represents the actual snow accumulation. So we had a big snowpack. It persisted all winter long until spring. Here in 2016, it kind of, pretty lame. And we'd get snow melt events one after another as we went along. The squiggly line here is air temperature. And so in the winter, it gets really cold in the air and obviously really warm in the summer. Soil temperature, this is the dashed line is the reference, meaning we didn't shovel it. And the solid line is the most bold here is the soil temperature in plots that we treated, that we removed the soil. And so the take homes from this are in 2015 with lots of snow, you see that this dashed line, the soil almost never froze. It froze only very slightly for short periods of time. Without the snow, the soil essentially froze pretty hard and stayed frozen almost all winter, except for one excursion. And then snow melt, the day that there's no more physical snow on the landscape, which is a big day in ecosystems because suddenly the sun can reach the forest floor and warms up fast and all sorts of things happen. So that event happened April 15th in 2015. And so a very different character to 2016, where you see that we had very little snow. The temperature of the soil was without the snow on it, was kind of ragtag, but it wasn't as cold a winter as the previous winter. The reference untreated, meaning we didn't remove the snow, but the snow was removing itself because we kept on having snowmelt events. And so both of the lines are squiggling up and down with multiple freezes throughout the winter. In addition, that year, snowmelt was like 2 months earlier. It was February 20th, and we didn't have a snowpack after that. So these are dramatically different years in the life of an ecosystem. Take one more look at those data before I move on. And here we were specifically looking at the number of freeze-thaw events, the number of events where it got warm in the middle of the winter enough so that you get thawing, including of the soil. And just one event happened in 2015, as we saw it was very cold and lots of snow. But in 2016, every other week we had a snowmelt event, and so each of those little areas circled as a snowmelt event. However, interestingly, when the ground freezes in the winter, typically we get what we call granular frost, which means that there's still pore spaces in between the frozen grains of soil, or frozen, I should say, crumbs and aggregates, microaggregates of soil. In 2015, the only time it got warm enough to thaw was we got a rain on snow event. And so these are more common with the changing climate and have a greater impact. And when you get a rain on snow event, if the rain soaks the snowpack and gets into the soil, it will warm the soil, and it will also saturate the soil. And then when it freezes, and 24 hours after this event, it froze hard. Then when it freezes, you've got soil that has almost no pore space left because it's full of water. And when that freezes and expands, it has an impact on soil structure, on microbes, on root tissues that are overwintering, et cetera. And we saw that, and I won't get into those data, but we saw that in the biological response from this one particular event. So these kinds of phenomena, rain on snow and lots of snowmelt events throughout the winter, are part of what we see more frequently with the changing winter. What's new about a changing winter, kind of paraphrasing what we just talked about. There's a couple of concepts that go with changing winters that I just mentioned to introduce. One has to do with winter whiplash, which really is talking about rapid changes that take place in winter, much like we just described for the rain on snow event. And this figure, we're not going to dissect it more than to say it comes from a paper by Wason in 2019. These little graphs are representing, the autumn when we get a extra cold, winter when we have events that get extra warm, and then spring when we get extra cold. And in the autumn we can get a cold snap, but autumn is later, and so we'll then follow that by often more autumnal types of temperatures, and that cold snap has biological importance. We can get a snowstorm in the middle of this and then go on with the rest of autumn. Likewise, in the spring, we can get late season snowstorms. This one's particularly important, spring cold snaps, because as ecosystems begin to do their biological thing earlier in the spring, sometimes they are farther along. And listen to me, physiologically, there's an expert in the room to address that. But if we then get a cold snap, we have more developed tissues that are more vulnerable to damage. And so these kinds of events largely have a negative impact. And then in the winter, we get a winter heat wave, we get the rain on snow event that I already mentioned, are generally have a negative impact on these ecosystems. We just had an event this winter. This was, where's the date? It was in February. Oh, February 24th, this past winter, when, you know, we had a 50-degree change overnight in temperature. Just, you know, now we go inside and take our sweater off or put our sweater on, but ecosystems don't have that luxury. Two other concepts, and then I'll wrap up. One is we talk about ecological surprises, and that has to do with I think us as scientists learning that some of the responses in ecosystems are unexpected. And of course, we dive in then to try and understand why they do what they do. And this is an example having to do with soils, no surprise. For yellow cedar in Alaska, it's relevant to species along coastal regions in the Northern Hemisphere in a lot of places, although I haven't seen evidence of any of this kind of damage to trees in Maine, at least to date. But to make this short, yellow cedar were dieback of them in coastal Alaska back in the 2000s. And for a while, we were wondering what was going on, and the scientists there were working on it. These trees live in a wet soil habitat, which is key. So the soils have lots of moisture in it. But as climate was making the spring snow less persistent and abundant, we had less protection of the soil. Meanwhile, the earlier spring was allowing for earlier dehardening of the trees, beginning of growth. And then what would happen is the cold weather, because there's no snow and the trees are farther along, when it did freeze, we would get root damage. And these, because they're on the coast, they're in a warmer setting, they're more likely to be more advanced. But if you do get a frost, then it has a greater impact. And in this case, it was causing the dieback, and there's papers that report on this phenomenon, other coastal northern latitude environments. And then finally, I'll just mention the vernal transition is a phrase having to do with some of what we've just alluded to. This is a little like the data that I showed you. This is from a paper by Peter Grofman down at Carey Institute back in 2012, but it's a nice sort of cartoon underscoring that when the snowpack goes out, we have rapid changes. And here again is the plot of soil temperature. It's kind of humming along under the snowpack, not quite frozen. And then the snowpack disappears, sunlight can hit it, and you get a rapid warming, and all of the world's biology responds to that, from roots to microorganisms to trees. And this vernal for spring asynchrony, the vernal transition, is a really dynamic area. And what is probably the take-home message is that as this is changing, the elements and components of how this ecosystem works are also changing, but not all at the same rate. And so while, you know, one organism's time, well, it's kind of the work I do. An organism might be timed to begin to grow when nitrogen's beginning to be released and mineralized from the organic matter in the soil as it warms up. Now the rooting may start later, or the mineralization may start earlier. And so the synchrony that it persisted for many years no longer is working as well as it would. And so I think I'll stop there. Yeah. So I'll stop there. That just to give you some ways of thinking about winter, the complexity of winter, and the changes taking place, and sort of all of these certainly are the backdrop to what Jay is now going to describe. So I'm going to stop share and take it away, Jay.
Great, thanks, Ivan. Let's see. All right. All right. Well, thanks everyone for hanging in there tonight. Ivan, that was a great setup, I think, for some of the things we're we're going to talk about, I'm going to zoom in much more into trees and physically how trees actually sense and respond to the cold temperatures. And so hopefully after this talk today, you'll be able to look at your trees a little bit differently, maybe when you head out the door tomorrow morning, and think about the things that they're doing today right now to prepare for winter, and then we can think about what they actually do during a changing climate during the winter. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is, how does a tree even know that winter is coming? It's pretty amazing actually that our forest ecosystems can detect this. Without getting into the detailed cell biology of how this works, plants can actually detect day length. And so the primary signal that plants use to know that winter is coming is day length. So as the days get shorter, which we're all sensing right now, plants can now have evolved to initiate what we call their fall phenology. Phenology just means the timing of biological events. So they just initiate all of those things, including beautiful leaf colors that we're used to seeing in the Northeast. However, there are secondary signals of temperature and moisture. Those also do impact the timing of events in the fall, because if there's still going to be favorable weather, there may be a benefit to some plants to continue photosynthesizing, for example, or continue growing if they can. But we typically find that those are relatively small effects, and we'll talk a little bit about how it has impacted things like fall color in particular this year, with the drought conditions that we saw across much of the state. Once trees have detected that winter is approaching, they do a couple of things to get ready for winter. The key reason for this is that trees are perennial organisms, which means they're around all of the time. And so they need to protect all of these sensitive tissues from freezing. Ivan showed those really nice graphs that demonstrated that the soil temperatures can often avoid freezing temperatures, or at least temperatures that are too cold. But all the above ground living matter of a tree, for example, is going to experience extreme cold temperatures. And just to contrast summer versus winter, this is from an experiment that we did in Massachusetts. It's quite hard to actually see the sapling trees plotted in these plots, but then I just split the diagram and showed an image from the middle of winter. And just kind of picture for yourself that feeling of a cold breeze on a cool sunny day in the middle of winter blasting across your face. That's exactly what the trees are experiencing. So they need to be able to handle both of these conditions. And so they're persisting throughout the winter in this case. The most important thing for plants, and plant cells in particular, is to avoid ice formation, or at least the damage that ice formation can cause to cells. So imagine if you've got your spinach salad that you're having for dinner, you put that spinach salad into the freezer and you pull it back out after 15 minutes or something, all of those cells will have frozen and ice crystals will have broken all of those cells, and you pull it back out, it's all going to wilt and collapse. And so plants have evolved a bunch of mechanisms to avoid damage occurring during those freezing events. And so in the fall, trees are doing a number of things. One thing they're doing is storing a bunch of sugars to get ready for next year, because they're going to have to grow a whole new set of leaves next year and do some new growth next year. There are many of them, especially the deciduous trees, are resorbing nutrients from their leaves. That means they're taking the nutrients and energy they invested in those leaves and trying to bring as much of that back into their perennial body, the woody plant body, so they can reuse those nutrients in the following spring. One of the critical ones there is nitrogen. And then they're focusing on increasing their cold tolerance of the living tissues that they're going to hang on to for the rest of the year. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the mechanisms that they can use to increase their cold tolerance. But the cold tolerance of a plant does change over the course of time. So let's talk a little bit about fall color, because it's getting to be the beautiful fall color season here in Maine. Let's just remind ourselves why leaves are green. Take you back to your intro biology classes. Leaves are green because they have chlorophyll molecules in them, and chlorophyll molecules are the molecules that help plants absorb light energy to run photosynthesis. And those molecules do not actually absorb green light. They reflect that green light back to our eyes. And so that's part of why leaves appear green to us. In the fall, however, the production and maintenance of those chlorophyll molecules starts to decline. The plants don't need to invest any more energy in maintaining those chlorophyll molecules and making new ones, because they know that winter is coming and they can start to abandon them, basically. And so as those chlorophyll molecules decline, that unmasks these other pigments, these other molecules that give leaves color and serve other functions in leaves. Carotenoids are these yellow colors that are always present in leaves, but you can't see them when the green chlorophyll molecules are present. So that's what causes this emergence of yellow color that we see across much of the United States. So here, this is a map of the US showing kind of dominant fall colors. You can see that the Northeast is dominated by these beautiful reds, driven primarily by the presence of maple species. But in many other places of the Midwest and even out west, you get a lot of yellows from things like poplar and aspen and other colors, other species like that. But these beautiful reds that we get in New England, those are driven by these other molecules called anthocyanins. And anthocyanins are actually, there's a couple of theories, but the dominant theory is that they're molecules that are produced in the leaves to protect the leaves during this time period, because they're still getting hit with light energy, and light energy can actually damage plants. And so these anthocyanin pigments help to protect the leaves while they're going through their critical process of resorbing some of those nutrients. And those are produced in the leaf during this time period. And so the thing that triggers the likelihood of a beautiful fall color season is actually the production of those anthocyanin, those red molecules. And it's promoted by having really warm, sunny days where they can produce a lot of sugars that they can use to build those molecules, having cool nights that are triggering the decline of chlorophyll, and having abundant soil moisture so the plant can continue to function adequately in that way. So that's one of the reasons we may have some slightly muted fall color for some of our dominant red species, the maples, this year. And so climate change may actually impact fall color. There's kind of a range, it's a bit hard to predict, but some of the best information we have on this has looked at fall color over a number of years and tried to model how do other factors like climate impact the variation we see year to year, and how can we use that to project into the future. So this graphic here is showing on the x-axis just the fall seasons. We've got September as the first month, October, the middle month. Remember, October is kind of our key fall color month, and then November after that. And for a range of species here, I think this was done in Massachusetts, we're showing kind of when they have peak color, and they have kind of a metric they use to measure color for each of these trees. So you can see red and maple peaking in kind of mid or early October, where sugar maple was a little bit later. Here's our ash trees that often get started a little bit earlier than a lot of other trees, for example. And so using these data, they were able to project into the future a little bit. And generally what they found is that we can expect slightly more color and as much as 1 week longer of color duration for most species as we go through the next 50 to 100 years of climate change. So it doesn't sound too bad for the fall color perspective. However, in contrast, we will have these increases in heat stress and drought conditions like we saw this year. And those tend to either reduce the fall color or delay the fall color. So those discrete events may give us individual years that don't give us such beautiful fall color as we often expect. However, I want to reiterate that there's some other things going on with climate change impacting the ability of a tree to survive in a specific location, for example. And so the dominant driver of the fall color that we see, if you think back to that map I just showed you, is the presence of a species that can produce really beautiful fall color. And so just having those maples on your landscape really increases the chances that you'll have that beautiful fall color. So that's really the key determinant of your fall color season. And this brings us to this concept of the two different leaf types that we have in New England. We have evergreen leaves and we have deciduous leaves, leaves that are dropped every fall. And so here's a white pine tree that has evergreen leaves, and it holds on to those leaves. We call them needles, but they're actually leaves. It holds on to those needles all year long, whereas a species like this maple here drops those leaves every fall. And those represent two strategies for surviving these cold temperatures that plants are preparing for. These evergreen species, they need to now build leaves or change the structures of their leaves so that they can tolerate these very cold temperatures that are coming up. Whereas these deciduous species, they avoid that entire problem by dropping their leaves. So they don't have to try to protect those leaves through that cold season. So those are two different strategies that we see on the landscape. One of the things that I think is often overlooked when we think about fall colors, we focus on the reds and the yellows and the green and the reds and the yellows primarily, and some of the oranges. Is the beautiful greens that are mixed in with that. So as you watch the fall color season this year, appreciate the evergreen species that are giving you a dark green background for the beautiful red maple tree, for example, that's giving you that fall color. That really gives us kind of, especially in Maine, kind of a really unique landscape of fall color. So I thought rather than go into all the details of how plants, what they do in winter, we could use a case study of a species that's iconic in Maine, red spruce. And here we're going to be discussing some research on the cold hardiness of red spruce foliage. Red spruce has gone through some challenges in the past with acid rain. We'll talk about that in a minute. Here we can see a graph that's depicting over the course of an entire winter. So here we've got winter in the middle, December, January, February. The values here are the cold hardiness of the foliage, basically representing how cold can the temperatures get before they damage and kill leaves on the plant. So you can see in August, if we had really, really cold temperatures that popped up, the red spruce trees would not be ready for it. They can only handle temperatures as cold as maybe -8 degrees Celsius, a little bit below freezing. Whereas in December, January, and February, they can handle temperatures down to -40 degrees Celsius. And there they're using a whole bunch of adaptations where they're increasing the cold tolerance of their tissues by doing things like increasing the solute concentration. So it's basically like adding salts you can think of to their cells to reduce the chances of freezing. They have special adaptations that allow them to avoid ice formation, and they can even change the cells, the walls of their cells, to make them more likely to resist damage if that ice does start to form in those cells. Those are just a couple of examples. But what we were observing, well, I wasn't doing research back then, Ivan was, so he'll be able to talk more about it if you have questions. But what was observed was there was a lot of mortality of needles on red spruce trees in this time period. And this got linked mechanistically down to acid rain. And so what they found in studies in the lab determined that the acidity of the rainfall that was driven by pollution acidifying the rain was actually leaching calcium from the needles of trees. And that calcium was really critical for developing and maintaining this cold tolerance. And so we were actually reducing the cold tolerance of those needles with this acidity of rainfall that we were adding. So that made them more susceptible to really cold temperatures, and that could actually damage the needles. So another example, kind of like Ivan's cedar example that he was talking about out west. We have kind of this complex response. However, red spruce is actually a unique species because you can think that that acidity was impacting all of the trees that held onto their needles and were experiencing these cold temperatures. So if you actually compare the cold hardiness of a range of different species in March, kind of a relatively cold time of year, here I've got the values in Celsius and degrees Fahrenheit for you to be able to compare the two. But you can see red spruce is actually one of the least cold hardy species of the dominant evergreen species that we have in our region. So white spruce and red pine, for example, can survive temperatures lower than -90 degrees Celsius or -130 degrees Fahrenheit. So you're really not likely to damage those trees with really cold temperatures. And so red spruce was actually not acclimated to these cold temperatures or adapted to these cold temperatures. And because of the slight change in cold hardiness from acid rain, that pushed it kind of above this threshold where cold temperatures could still damage it. So that was kind of an example of how we move through a winter season. And I did want to talk a little bit about springtime and how plants detect and respond to spring. So the things that drive the timing of leaf out in the spring, for example, there's really three things. And the dominant thing is winter chilling. And this is the one that I think is really critical when we think about warming climate and warming winters. Winter chilling requirements for species is basically evolved trait where plants can detect how much and how long they've experienced cold temperatures for. That allows them to ensure that they don't put out a new set of leaves until they're really sure they went through a winter. So for example, if we have plants drop their leaves in October and then all of a sudden December gets really warm, we're not going to have all of our trees, our deciduous trees, produce new leaves that would just get damaged because it's pretty clear that they haven't been through a winter. And so winter chilling requirements are critical for species, especially in the northeastern United States. They need to meet those thresholds. So once they've experienced a certain amount and duration of cold temperatures, then now they're able to initiate their spring phenology when they get what we call this spring forcing or these spring warming events. So then they respond to the warmer temperatures and the longer day lengths. Those things kind of all combined then start to trigger our early spring phenology. What we also see is that the timing of spring activity in trees is moving forward with warming. So trees are leafing out earlier in the springtime with warming. We generally do see that. And that's because they're still meeting their winter chilling requirements. And then they're getting these warm days earlier in the season. And the day lengths aren't quite a restraint on their spring activity. However, we don't see that they're extending their fall timing much further back. And that's in part because when we talked about fall processes, those were driven primarily by photoperiod, the length of the day, not driven by things like temperature. One of the challenges with this winter chilling requirement is that this differs by species, and our more boreal type species tend to have a higher winter chilling requirement. So if we all of a sudden have really, really warm temperatures here, we could have boreal tree species that don't meet their winter chilling requirements, and therefore they don't respond to the spring warm up and start growing new leaves that following spring, whereas other species, maybe from further south, can respond to that. So they may be able to take advantage of these longer growth seasons. So a lot of complexity there still to be teased apart. I wanted to give a case study about an extreme winter warming event. This happened in Wisconsin in 2017. In February, they had 6 consecutive days above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. I think they even had one day that was above 70 degrees Fahrenheit in there. And this is about 2 months earlier than usual for those types of temperatures. Here's a map of kind of around that time period, not those exact 6 days, but a map of temperature anomaly. So kind of the difference from average temperatures. And you can see here, it's quite warm across much of the eastern United States. And I put a star where this study was done for that February. And what they found is that a bunch of tree species in this study already started to initiate leaf out and bud burst in the spring. And so here they're ranking a bunch of different species, whether they became active during that warm period, they're in green, or if they stayed dormant, they're in kind of this orange color. And they found that these more shade intolerant, fast growing species tended to be more responsive to that warming event, and they started to initiate their spring phenology, kind of backing up a little bit of what we were just saying, where those are the species that are going to be able to take advantage of these earlier springs. However, it got cold again after this cold event, and it did start to damage some of these plants. However, the authors do note that the damage was relatively minimal, so that we still have a lot to learn about how these types of events may cascade to actually impact the health of those trees longer term, rather than just the individual leaves that get damaged. I also wanted to talk a little bit about summer warming. So some of my research is moving into this these winter warming studies, but I've done a lot more with summer warming and drought effects. This is some work that's not my own work. This came out of Minnesota from Peter Reich, who does a lot of studies on this. And he did some experimental work where they set up some experimental warming plots in the forest. So they actually warmed sections of the forest different amounts, and they studied how tree growth responded and tree survival responded to those. And so each one of these little panels here represents a different species. If you know your scientific names, you'll be able to track the species. But here we've got balsam fir, we have white spruce, we have white pine, Pinus strobus over here. Here's 2 maples, red maple and sugar maple. Here's a couple of oaks down here and paper birch. And then within each of these species panels, we have the ambient temperature condition, warmed 1.6 degrees Celsius and warmed 3.1 degrees Celsius. So kind of a range of warming conditions. And then the set of bars on the right-hand side is that same condition, but under reduced rainfall treatment. So that's under drought. So now I'm going to walk you through some of the key takeaways from this. Generally, what they found is that warming drives increased photosynthesis, which drove increased growth of these temperate trees. The y-axis here represents biomass of the trees. And so here this shows for a bunch of these more temperate tree species, these green arrows represent if you warm them up and they have abundant rainfall, they're going to grow more. They're going to do really well. However, most of our boreal type trees experience some degree of decline with that. So here we can look at balsam fir, for example. Even just 1.6 degrees of warming caused a reduction in the growth of balsam fir. And then we also have the drought story on top of there. We found that drought drives declines in most species. So rather than walking through all of these, I'll just show you 2 examples. So here's white pine on the right-hand side. So white pine did okay in the ambient warming condition, or in the ambient rainfall condition, when it was only warmed a little bit. Didn't change its total growth. When you warm it a lot, it declined quite a bit. And what they found is that if you warm it just a little bit, but also reduce rainfall, now all of a sudden that slight amount of warming with the drought as well causes a major reduction in growth for white pine. So this is where some of these what we call compounded stressors, both warming and drought, become really important and can cause us to see changes in our forest ecosystems more quickly. And then paper birch on the bottom left here. Paper birch, when it had plenty of rainfall, as you warmed it up, it grew quite a bit better. It grew 3 times better when it was 3 degrees Celsius warmer. That's this orange bar up here. However, when you introduce drought conditions to that scenario, you can see a complete reversal in the growth patterns where paper birch did not grow well at all in any of the dry conditions. And these were actually moderate drought conditions, not even a severe drought that they were simulating here. So you can see how the interaction between temperature and precipitation in the growing season is going to be really critical for the future of our forests as well. Last thing I wanted to plug was some new research that we just got funded by the Northeastern States Research Cooperative. This is a project in collaboration with Nick Fisichella from the Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park, and then 2 other scientists here at the University of Maine, Nicole Rogers and John Zhang. And here we're looking at the impacts of some of these extreme climate events on tree regeneration in the northern forest. We're looking at things like heat and drought, like I just showed you before, but also midwinter warming study. And these are the 6 locations across the state where we're going to be doing some of these installations. So keep an eye out over the next couple of years, or invite me back for another talk, and I'll give you all an update on what we've been finding relative to some of those challenges. With that, I'll finish with yet another beautiful snow picture. This is out of my window. I think this is one of our April snowstorms that we had a year or 2 ago. And those are my gray birch trees bending over and touching my garage. So, with that, I'll say thank you, and we'll, I guess, open it up for questions. Thanks.
Wow, a lot to unpack there. Thank you so much. Someone wanted to know if there's any chance of getting copies of the slides that you shared. Is that possible? That'd be great.
I'll send them to you, Caroline, I guess, and they can follow up.
That'd be great. And I can post them on our website with a summary of what you've highlights of what you've talked about. So feel free, folks. You could try unmuting yourself and asking questions directly, or you can put questions into the chat box. One question is from Bryce. For what reasons is the Maine winter warming faster than the other seasons? I don't know who wants to take that on.
Seems like an Ivan question.
Well, yeah, so I have to pull out my climatology. What's the mechanism for that?
Yeah, I can give one example at least.
Yeah, go ahead.
With the albedo effect. I mean, to kind of link back to the snow cover. I don't know how much that impacts Maine specifically, but snow is white, so it reflects a lot of energy during the winter time. And so as you start to lose some of that snow cover, and like Ivan said, in the springtime, once the ground is exposed, now that ground can absorb that energy that was being reflected by the snow lake, so that ecosystem starts to heat up. That's probably maybe not driving that entire effect, but that's one of, I think, the important factors, and one of the reasons that understanding our snowpack is so important for how it relates to those temperatures.
Yeah, that I would just add, I'm trying to remember, there's upper and lower jet stream components to explanations that our colleague Sean Burkle, the state climatologist, should be answering. And it's telling me I have low resources, so I hope my voice is coming through. Some of the basics of it are that when you have more heat in the climate system, it's simply harder to achieve the extremes of cold because there's more energy basically, running around that you've got to move out of the way with Arctic cold as the jet stream dips. And so we fail to achieve the low lows of the seasons and particularly the low lows of winter itself. And so there's kind of some first principles involved there, but it's a more complex mechanism having to do with circumpolar jet stream dynamics that I can't explain. Good question.
Ivan, can you say something a little bit? I'm fascinated by the notion of concrete frost that you talked about. And can you just drill down into that a little bit in terms of how that, what's actually going on underground? I mean, I understand that basically there's suddenly the soil is rock hard, but as there's that freeze thaw happening, what are the systems that are being disrupted?
Yep. So it has to do with that it freezes and the lack of pore space because there was a rain event in the middle of the winter. And immediately after the rain event, the water, it's not 100% saturated, but essentially most of the pores are now filled with water. Then it freezes. And as we all know, when water freezes, it expands 7-9%, I forget the number. But its volume expands. And I suspect everyone here has driven on a Maine road. And so we know that in the spring, it's full of potholes. It's full of potholes because the water that seeps under that road, when it freezes, has nowhere to go. And we have a lot of that happening. We have a lot of repeated freezings. And the only place to go when that volume of saturated frozen ground freezes hard, it expands. The only place it has to go is up in the case of our roads. And so we get a pothole. In the example I was talking about in the ecosystem, the same kind of thing happens. It will expand up. That's the way you get seedlings, knocked over with freezing events in the spring. But it creates a pressure so that it literally crushes the cells of fine roots. It crushes the cells of bacteria and fungi because the pressure that builds up as it goes to expand, it fills up every pore and puts a lot of pressure until it starts to push upward. And eventually it'll push upward. But once you get a little bit into the soil, it takes a lot to push it upward. I mean, the freeze thaw kind of phenomena is happening near the surface because there is the surface to release that pressure. So it's simply a matter of no room to expand. As it's expanding, then the next thing that can collapse is cellular tissue in the soil.
And how deep is that concrete frost going into the ground?
Good question. I don't know. I mean, there's just a handful of studies in the ecological world. I'm sure there's tons of studies in engineering around roads, et cetera. But you can get pretty deep frost, 20, 25 centimeters down into the soil. And sometimes we'll see, given what I do for a living, I've dug a lot of holes in the ground, sampling soils. And in late spring, we'll be digging a soil pit for scientific purposes and find ice lenses that are, 20 centimeters down. And that ice lens is a lens because it melted from the bottom and it melted from the top, but it's still protected. But that means at one point it was frozen to the surface when that was created.
Question for you, Ivan, from Nora. She says, you talked a lot about a past grad student doing work around snow cover in 2015 and 2016. Did anyone continue that work after that student moved on?
No, that was, a graduate student thesis based 2-year experiment. Probably the longest, in the Western hemisphere, the longest snow removal experiment that I'm familiar with is at Hubbard Brook, where they've done I don't know how many years now, they've been doing snow removal with, many more scientists involved in that one. And so someone had an interest in sort of the multiple year impacts, which are fascinating. I check out the Hubbard Brook website, and Pam Templer at Boston University is kind of the lead of that project.
Okay. Robin asks, in which species of Maine trees are we seeing changes in their ranges that could be due to warming trends?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're kind of in an interesting time with climate change, because if you look at the projections, and many of you have probably seen them, the projections are that as early as by 2060, the climate conditions that are suitable for spruce and fir trees in the state, for example, will pretty much be gone from the state.
Wow.
So those are the climate conditions, though, that are suitable for spruce and fir trees. that doesn't mean that the spruce and fir trees won't be here. So they're still going to be here. So don't worry about that. It doesn't mean that you have to worry about all those trees dying right now, but it does point to a lack of our understanding of how will our trees that will still be here be responding to these conditions that they've never experienced before. And that's one of the things that we try to focus in on with our research in our lab, where we try to do these experimental approaches where we simulate these conditions that are new and novel conditions for these tree species. And we expect that there's a level of resilience in our forests where they're going to be able to handle something beyond what they've typically seen. But what we're not really seeing right now are major changes in species ranges. One reason why is that it takes a really long time for trees to move. And the major climate changes that we've seen have been in the relatively recent, the last 20 to 30 years, or when we've seen the biggest changes in our climate. And that's way too quick for the time scale of the tree species. When you think about it, it needs to disperse a long distance, compete in an existing forest system, and then get itself established. So we have major lags in how our trees are responding distribution-wise to climate change. But there's new opportunities for things like restoration and management now with the changed climate. And so you can introduce species manually into places where they probably wouldn't have been able to survive before. And that's allowing us to expand our range of some species a little bit. So your ornamental plants in your gardens, for example, you can start pushing the envelope on some of those a little bit. You may still get some cold temperatures that knock them back, but those are definitely still starting to expand. So the short answer is we haven't seen major changes in species distributions in the state yet, and they're going to be slow to respond to the rapidly changing climate. Good question.
Great question from Steve Pelletier. Do freezing soil temperatures have a greater influence on soil mycorrhizae surrounding tree roots or individual tree species?
Yeah, Steve, I wasn't sure what you meant by or individual tree species.
I wonder if he's, Steve, feel free to unmute if you want to. I'm wondering if he's asking whether is the impact more on sort of the forest system, mycorrhizae, the forest system as a whole, or individual trees. Steve, do you want to unmute? And
yeah, hi guys. No, is it I'm assuming it's a combination. Is it the soil mycorrhizae around the individual roots, or is it more what Jay was talking about, things like the red pine and white spruce? They seem to do better. Is it because of the physiology of the tree itself, or is it the mycorrhiza around the tree roots, or is it a combination of both?
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's I think it's a combination of both. I think with the cold temperatures that I was talking about and cold tolerance for those species, that really comes down to a lot of the above ground tissues, and some of the interesting data that Ivan was sharing reminds us that we don't often get super cold temperatures in the soil. When we do, it has big impacts on our trees, but they don't actually make their below ground tissues very cold tolerant. So those freezing temperatures in the soil are likely to impact both, I would suggest. We typically see like -5 to -10 degrees Celsius is what it takes to actually damage and kill root systems. And that's why that loss of that snow cover is really critical for the survival of roots, especially when most of our roots, something like, 90% of our roots, the fine roots are within the top foot of soil. That's where all of our roots really are focused. And so that's where these freezing events can occur. So maybe not a super satisfying answer for you, Steve, but it definitely is a combination of how both of those important factors respond.
No, that's all good. Thank you very much.
Yep.
all right, here's a basic science question from Charlotte. She says, I learned many years ago that molecules become closer together as they move from gas to liquid to solid. So the molecules become more compact. So why is it then that water expands when it goes from liquid to solid? Either of you want to take that?
Yeah,
Take that
Charlie,
on?
you're killing me here. So, do you know that one off the cuff?
Yeah, I teach that one in my class. I'm trying to remember now the detail, but it has to do with the structure of the water molecule. And I think it's because of the oxygen atom in those molecules is so if you want me to use a term, electronegative, which is maybe one you haven't heard in a while if you're not in that realm. So at the very last moment before they freeze into this lattice structure, they repel each other a little bit because those oxygen molecules are so electronegative. It's kind of my understanding. And that
Yep.
slight repel as they finally solidify is what gives the expansion. Is that right, Ivan?
Yeah, I pretty much, pretty much I don't know it any better myself for sure, but water is most dense at 4 degrees before it freezes. And we see that because ice floats and we know it's less dense. And as it approaches freezing, that mechanism causes the molecules of water to line up. And in fact, they tend to form a hexagonal shape as they sort of line up in little rings anytime they have really low energy. We know that, in the soils world, because the last layer of water molecules adsorbed onto little clays and soils sort of line up in a hexagon as the energy is reduced. And so the electronegativity is driving that phenomenon under those unique conditions. But because it lines up geometrically, now it creates more space in a sort of quantum scale, but more space, making it less dense as compared to the water molecules at 4 degrees, where they can pack in, just like you said, with the cold.
So one thing that I always bring up with students when we talk about ice relative to biology is how important that little fact is that ice floats. Because if you consider if ice did not float, life on Earth would not exist as we know it, because in the winter time, ice would form on lakes and rivers and the oceans, and then that ice would sink and it would never see the light of day again. And all of those water bodies would fill up with ice and we wouldn't have the water that we know and love. So it's kind of an interesting thought experiment for the value of the fact that ice actually does float.
That is great. I love that. So last question, and then we will let you get back to your evenings. Have you identified any areas that could be seen as climate refuges on a micro scale or otherwise that could potentially sustain the composition of Maine's forest, particularly in the boreal species?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a lot of research looking into those questions right now. And the short answer is yes. And they're often in the places that you'd expect. And so you're looking for an area that's kind of perpetually cool and moist because of maybe the local hydrology, maybe because it's on a northern slope and so it's not exposed to as much sun. And one of the questions that we're starting to look at in our research group is the impact of the coast. And so we know that the coast has been historically relatively cool in terms of in the summertime because of the cool ocean that provides those cool conditions. And so spruce and fir trees can grow pretty far south along the coast, more so than they can just inland. And one of the questions is, as we get more and more warming and as the ocean continues to warm, will that continue to also create this refugia for coastal spruce and fir trees? And that's kind of an unknown right now. But in the end, the short answer is yes, there are refugia. And so when we say that spruce and fir trees won't find their suitable habitat in Maine, there definitely will be pockets in these areas where cold air pools and where you have maybe abundant groundwater that's reaching the surface. That's always cool too. So for sure.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for your work. This is really everything related to climate is so important, and our beloved Maine forest is such a signature part of our state that it's really helpful to learn more about what's happening. And so that I suppose the next presentation is going to have to be about the what can we do to cultivate resilience as these impacts go forward, while we are all working hard to minimize the impact by doing what we can to scale back climate change. So thank you both so much. And if you could send me your PowerPoints so I can share them with folks, that would be great. Really appreciate your sharing your time with us tonight. So thanks everybody. There's all sorts of thank yous coming in. Someone says, please return to tell us soon about your new results.
Will do.
Oh, we may hit you up again. All right. Have a great night, everybody.
Bye-bye.